Okay, we're gonna start on time right away. So I had a chance to look at some of your organisms that you submitted, and a few of you stumbled upon today's champion organism number 1. Before we get into that real quick, I just wanted to give a quick reminder of what you're doing today if you haven't already read the directions. So today, we're going to practice using the biomimicry taxonomy and life's principles today. I want you to primarily focus on the taxonomy. Again, having a copy right in front of you is going to be really helpful. If you've highlighted the areas that I recommended you highlighting, that's also going to help you find functions really quickly. If you find other things that aren't related to the 1, 2, 3, and 4 areas, you can add those on as well. I had a couple people in the last couple days text me and ask me specifically when you're working on the project that's due, not this Saturday, but next Saturday, what should you be using? You are using the organism that we are studying. So the last 2 weeks before this, it was all bioluminescent organisms. This week and next week, you're only using the families of organisms that I talk about. So if I'm talking about bats, for example, that do a specific thing, then you can talk about all bats that do that specific thing, but you have to stay within that category of organisms and the functions that we're talking about. Okay, so we're gonna get some practice on that today. I want you to take notes. I want you to do it just like you guys did for the story of bioluminescence. Please don't write down every word. Don't try to make your brains do that. Get big ideas, get vocabulary words, make yourself a little chart. And at the end of it, I've got some of my notes up there and some little drawings of the things that they do. So feel free to sort of scribble those down too, but just get the big ideas. As soon as you jot something down, or if that light bulb goes off in your brain, you're like, aha, there's an example, I know what that is, then I recommend marking it, circling it, whatever, on your taxonomy. If you hear it again, and the same one again, and the same one again, you can even mark like little tallies by it, like, oh, she said this one 6 times, so it must be really useful. And when I do my final project, I should definitely look at that one and incorporate that into my design. So highlight, circle, underline, mark all over that thing, annotate that thing. When I was doing a second version of mine, I also just wrote like little words on here to remind myself what they were doing. To sort of like talk back and forth between my notes and the taxonomy. Oh, really quickly, I find a lot of people accidentally mix these two up. I know that when you think about it, you don't, but just on the taxonomy itself. So I want you to look at the sensing the signals and the sending of signals, because they have, under process information, they have almost all sort of the identical features in them. So what I did up here is I drew a couple arrows right here. If it's sending, obviously it's putting that thing out. So on mine, I drew like a big arrow going out under sending, and under sensing, obviously they're bringing that in, and there's sensors and receptors and a whole completely different set of adaptations. So on mine, I just drew an arrow out and then an arrow back in. So just I could find it quickly and not sort of mark the wrong one. I know you guys know what that means. So today we're going to talk about one of the massively unsung heroes of biology. We tend to think of them either as something to eradicate as a pest, or we completely ignore them altogether. And like I said, a few of you have stumbled upon them. So I'm going to give you some clues. What are these things? They are a superorganism in all the ways. So, well, these organisms are farmers. These organisms are also ranchers. So like these would be some keywords to write down. They herd up another animal, and there's some nutrients that they're gathering. They also farm, okay? Well, what else do they do? Well, they build massive, really complex, complicated structures. Even crazier than that, within these structures, and they could be like a mansion connected to another one, connected to another one, connected to another one, and etc. You might have thousands of them connected. Within their architecture, they can control the humidity, and they can control the temperature, which is something even humans don't do very well. So I'm already thinking of some life's principles in my brain. You're like, ooh, okay, she's already kind of getting into that. What else do they do? Well, they can make ladders and they can make bridges. They can also fill holes. So if they're on a particular path and there's a giant pothole, they can fill it. They're also capable of building rafts. So if there is a natural disaster where water is involved, they can all escape their giant subterranean mansions, build a raft, and survive on the raft for at least a week and still survive. They have a combination of a trash pile, which also doubles as a cemetery. Now, if you happen to die in the home and they just find you as they're walking through the corridors, walking through the hallways, and they see your dead body, they just leave it there. Whatever. But the second that you start to stink of oleic acid, which is one of the scents that says, oh, that thing's decomposing, they will grab your body, now that it's rotting, walk you over to the cemetery / dump and throw you in there. So a specific site for body dumping, just like the mafia. Now, they also, so yeah, kind of said that right here. Oh, this is also Cappadocia, which is in Turkey. That's a massive human underground settlement. As kind of an analogy, if you haven't learned about that, take a second later on Google and just search for this. It's maddening and amazing and crazy. So taking out the trash. All right, they also have really complex warfare. Biological warfare. They form structures like this phalanx here, and they also employ beheading as a strategy. So of course, you know, I think this is great. Okay, what else do they do? Well, they can make highways and they can make gardens. They're also capable of making antibiotics.
How so?
Now, the last thing that's interesting, so we talked about all these different jobs: farmers, ranchers, architects, construction workers, carpenters, repair people, engineers, waste management, burial services, soldiers, protectors, and people in transportation, pharmaceuticals. We have all these different jobs. And we know that sometimes they may start off as one job. And as they get older, they may transfer into other jobs, just like we do as we grow older and we mature. Now, there are over 15,000 different species. So today I'm going to talk about just sort of the general patterns that we see, and then Monday we'll get into some really cool, gnarly, specific details. 15,000 different species. To put that into a framework, a comparison for you, there are only 6,500 species of mammals. So think about all the mammals that you know. That's about half as many species as the organism I'm talking about today. So who is it?
Wait, how many species did you say this one has?
15,000. There's 15,000 different ones.
Mushrooms?
Close, they're in that family.
The termites?
Close.
Antes.
If you thought ants in your brain, and ants they do a lot of the same things as termites. They are both eusocial animals, which means they do form giant categories. So, imagine the family reunions, indeed. So if you guessed ants, you're right. And you might be thinking, okay, Jerlinga, what is so exciting about ants? Well, obviously all the things that I previewed for you are pretty incredible, being that they tend to be so tiny. So, what I want you to also think about in terms of your Saturday project is the opportunity for emulation on multiple scales here. So we have strategies that they're using as an entire system, as an entire colony. So that's one place where you could emulate and steal some of those ideas and say, what can I do with this? You also have individual strategies. What is that individual ant doing? What is it sensing? How is it reacting? What is its job? You have an individual. Monday, we're going to go down and look at the organ, cellular, molecular level of these things. So as you're looking at this stuff, kind of keep track of the scale and the scope, because you're going to have a ton of different strategies that you could emulate. I want to just mention one thing. Ants are brutal. I already talked about how they use chemical warfare and they behead their enemies. That would be bad biomimicry. So obviously we don't want to emulate everything. There are no ethics in an ant colony. Okay, so they have tools that they use for these three things, which we identified as kind of the major area in our taxonomy. Navigation, how do I get there and back? Route finding is more like, where should I go? How do I get back efficiently? And resource identification, where's the stuff? That foundation, the strategies they use for those three things are the same strategies they use for every other thing that I listed in the beginning. So because they use these strategies, they can do everything else. We're going to focus on these three things eventually. Now, before we get there though, before we start looking at their strategies, there's two major things you have to know about ants to really build on this. So, first of all, you have to understand their caste system. How is their community organized? We know generally, again, this is not necessarily something that we want to emulate. We don't necessarily want to have a caste system here. And one way that you can kind of translate that into a more human design is thinking about the different jobs and how many people do those different jobs. That would be a better emulation than a hierarchy, which we'll see is completely different in the ant world too. Two, and maybe more importantly, we have to look at how decisions are made. Between these two things, once we know that, we kind of have a sense of everything and we can work from there. So we're going to start with the caste system so we know who our characters are. So there are three basic groups. We have the reproductive females, who you know as the queens. This shouldn't be new to you. We have the reproductive males, who are known as the drones, also shouldn't be new to you. And we have the non-reproductive females, which we know as the workers. So all of that should sound familiar. And if you're thinking, wait a second, I've heard of those words, but usually with a different animal. What's the other insect that we tend to combine with that?
Bees.
Bees. Now there's a reason for that. There's no coincidence that we use those same terms because they're all part of the same family. So when I was in Costa Rica and he was pointing out bullet ants, and he said, well, what do you notice about their bodies? And I never put this together before. And he was like, well, look at it. What does it look like? Well, it looks just like a hornet. It's just most of them don't have any wings. If you look at their morphology, their body structure, they're almost identical. So they're all in the Hymenoptera family. Hymen means membrane. That Pteura part means flight. And so that basically just means that they are the insects, for the most part, that have clear wings that are very membranous and they can fly. So they're all related. So that makes sense. So I just jotted down there, Beyonce was clearly onto something. Who runs the world? Well, it is kind of girls, only it's girl insects and not necessarily girl humans, as we will see in a moment. So three major groups. Well, first, we've got the queen. Now she's massive. Compared to all the other ants, she is just enormous. Because she's so big, she can't really get around. So she's either gonna stay in one place or she might have other ants help her around the way. So she's not agile, she's huge. Now, her abdomen right here is really interesting. So if you think about those lamps that you might get to decorate for a party or something that kind of start out flat and then you go and they form like a sphere, you hang them all over the ceiling, that's kind of what her abdomen does. So it starts off kind of smaller and you can see that there's these little ridges in here. And as she starts popping out more eggs, her abdomen expands and stretches this way. And it also goes and it gets bigger that way. So that is an interesting emulation just by itself of something that you could use. Like if I'm thinking about storage, that's interesting. She's interesting though. We tend to think of hierarchies because we're humans as someone being the boss. The queen is not the boss. The queen's only job is to keep the species alive. I mentioned wings a second ago. No, this is kind of screwed up. The queens are born with wings. But as soon as they mate, well, they don't really need to move around at all anymore. So they grab their legs, they reach back to their wings and they snap them off. Well, why would they do that? Well, resources. You don't feed what you don't need. She's like, I don't want to keep these things alive. I'm just going to sit here and pop out babies. So she doesn't need them anymore. Now, I did mention that she can't really get around. So in some cases, so you can see right here is a great picture of how the abdomen is expanding. So it used to just be these segments close together. Now you can see it's stretching, stretching, stretching. So this is an army ant. And army ants, unlike some ants, they don't burrow underground. They don't have those huge subterranean colonies. Instead, they move and then they ravage everything and they move and move and move and move constantly. And they have to protect the queen somehow. So they make something called a bivouac, which I wrote down there for you. So what they do is a bunch of ants will connect around the queen using their own bodies. So the queen will be in the middle. Then they'll put all the little larvae. Then they will sort of make a big structure around the queen, and then other ants will pile on, and they move like that as they're traveling. They do this every single day. So during the day, move, move, move. They find a new spot that's safe. They sort of dissolve this bivouac and they spread out in this enormous fan, strip all the life out of the place, and then they come back together at night. And there's always a few that are protecting the queen. They usually find like a log or something that they can kind of nestle her into. Then at night, they send out a couple scouts. Scouts are all right, what's our next step gonna be? I've done some recon, okay. And in the morning they rebuild and they do it again. This is also something that blew my mind. So like, think about humans doing that. If we needed to protect someone and we built a shelter that we could move out of our own bodies, it's weird. That's kind of genius too. That's called a bivouac. Okay, so next we have the drones. So the drones do nothing. Workers are in there doing stuff, the queen's in there doing stuff, they're not doing anything. So they sit around, they just take up space. After a few days of that, their wings are finally strong enough and they can take what's called a nuptial flight. So they leave their colony, never to come back again. They have about 1 hour to mate as many times as they can with other local communities. We don't want inbreeding. And then they die. So if you've ever seen Pixar's A Bug's Life and you have that main character Flick, like he would be long dead by now. And I wrote in there, don't even get me started with Nemo and his dad because that's even more disturbing. Now, E.O. Wilson, this gentleman you see on the right, who is basically like the guy when it comes to ants. And he's also just like a wonderful human. If you don't have any of his books, if you haven't read them, highly recommend. So he once referred to the drones as flying sperm missiles. Like that's all they do. They fly, they mate, they die. So I thought that was kind of a hilarious description. Flying sperm missiles. Okay, so now we get to the workers. And the workers, that's where, yeah, I said what I said, that's right. The workers are where we're gonna spend a lot of our time because these are the ones that do all of those jobs that I listed before. So within the other ants, we already saw that their morphology was different. And morphology just means the physical structure. So internal morphology would be anatomy, but all of it, if I'm just looking at what it looks like, that's kind of what I'm looking at. So in the drones, we've got wings. In the queen, we've got the expandable abdomen. She's got wings, she breaks them off. She's much bigger than the rest, but she can't really move. In the workers, we see a huge amount of diversity. And this makes sense because they do different jobs, so they need to have different body plans. So here's some things that they lack. We said they're non-reproductive. So first of all, they don't have any fallopian tubes. They don't have any way for their eggs to go into their body if they're born with them. 2, their ovaries are teeny, 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 tiny compared to the queens. So even if they wanted to reproduce, they can't. Now I mentioned that as some ant colonies, again, I'm generalizing here, as the ants mature and grow, their morphology, hormones will change what's happening in their body. So they're flicking different genes on, taking other genes, putting them off, and they can form completely different body types, which I think is fascinating. So if you look at this one in the middle, this is going to be one that generally is staying inside the colony and maybe is constructing and building all these tunnels. It's building the cemetery / trash dump. Maybe it's taking care of the queen and the youngins. The soldier is obviously going to be the one who's defense. They also have giant, sharp, pointy mandibles. So as the workers are maybe leaving and coming back with food, if there's something like a seed that they can't get open, those soldiers will also crack that thing open a little bit like a parrot beak. So maybe you're tending the queen when you're younger. Maybe as you're the oldest, they send the oldest off to war, which is not something that we do. Again, if we think about our elderly, the last thing we're going to want to do is send them into battle. So that's not a good thing to emulate. But in the ants sort of system, well, those are the ones that have spent the longest time serving the community. They have the most knowledge, and you know, they mature pretty quickly. So they don't want to get rid of a new resource. They'd rather get rid of an old resource.
Do they all spend time as a minima and then go to a worker?
Not all of
soldier?
them. A lot of them do, but not necessarily. And I'm making some generalizations here. Oh, they also, a lot of the soldiers, actually a lot of the ants in general, they make something called formic acid. And that's something that they will spray on predators. And so just like imagine like Batman movies and all these other things that you've seen, where like someone gets dumped into a vat of acid and their faces are destroyed or whatever. That's a little bit what these ants are going for. Now, I also mentioned that ants are both farmers and they are ranchers. And maybe this is something that you know already. This top right image, this is the internal sort of geography of what a leaf cutter ant's home looks like. And I'm sure we've all seen those images of them like going up in the tree, they snip this part of the leaf, they hold it, they go on their way, and there's like giant, huge lines of these things going back and forth. They're not eating the leaves. They take the leaves into their colony, which has to be the perfect temperature and the perfect humidity or it won't work. They'll get other things growing that they don't want. Other little parasites and mites and whatever. So they take the leaves, they put them in there, they poop on the leaves, and then this white fungus grows and they eat the fungus. And they have to tend this constantly because they don't want the wrong sort of fungus. They don't want any things that can destroy their crops, just like humans. So they're farmers. The other thing that's really interesting, and again, this might be something that you know, is they are also ranchers. There are multiple different ant species who do this. This particular example is the most famous. So you can see these little teeny green things on here. These are aphids. Now, aphids use their little piercing mouth parts to get into the sap, the nectar, whatever, of the stem of a plant. They drink it up, and just like a bee making honey, they concentrate it, and then they poop it out. But because it's sugary, the ants are like, ooh, delicious. So sugary poop candy is basically what they're making. And so the ants tend them. They make sure that they are safe. If a predator comes, they might attack that predator. If it rains for some of their other insects that they tend, different species, they will actually pick them up and move them under leaves so they are protected from the rain. They will also sometimes get them on their backs, and somehow, I don't know how they do this. It must be some sort of chemical process here, but they will also put the aphids on their back, and they will bring them to a new part of the plant that has better sap. So they are wrangling them, they are keeping them safe, they are protecting them. All these things that we just think humans do, ants do too. So obviously we've got a lot of workers who are also architects and construction workers, and we'll get to that in just a second. Now, just for a second, because I think leafcutter ants are amazing. So again, you've probably seen this before. They can carry up to 50 times their weight. So that would be like me. So I'm 5'4", I'm 130 pounds. That would be like me carrying a piano, which is about 1,000 pounds, putting a grizzly bear holding a punching bag on top of that piano, and a giraffe on top of that. And then I could still like carry all my groceries in with only making like one trip to the car. That's insane. And that's what they can do, which is incredible. So there's not necessarily a lot of scaling that we can always do with that sort of strength. There are obviously limitations and boundaries, some operating conditions in there that relate to having an exoskeleton rather than an endoskeleton, but still amazing. So back to structures. I mentioned earlier that they make rafts. Well, they make rafts just like so many of these other things out of their own bodies. If they're, and again, this is not the roving army or marauder ants. These are ones that have those deep colonies underground. If the flooding starts to come, and they build their nests in a way that sort of prevents a little bit of flooding. Yeah, it is like that scene. So they have, on the external part of their bodies, they have basically a makeup that doesn't like water. We call that hydrophobic, like something, think of it as something waxy. And so a bunch of the ants go together, and then what they do is they find the edge of the raft. And once they notice, oh, that's the edge of the raft, they use their mandibles and they clamp on. And then they use their legs and they clamp on, and they do this at 90-degree angles. And so they spread out into this giant pancake raft, just going, okay, edge, 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 okay, clamp, 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 clamp. They can live on this thing in some cases for up to a week, and they'll float away, and then they'll get back to land, good to go. They can start a new colony. They can also make bridges. So we see a ton of cooperation here. The idea of them reaching till the end is the same strategy they're using. It's different, just a different shape. So they're just like reaching out, they grab onto each other, another one reaches out. They can change the width of this bridge, and somehow they can sense, probably through pheromones, if it's ending, they don't need any more, and then they will dissolve it. They can also make ladders out of their own bodies as well, which if you think about it, it's just a vertical bridge. So we just have multiple different forms making slightly different functions, but they're using that same strategy of like bite, hook, look for the edge. Now, they can also make crazy enormous structures. Now the normal ant, you just see like ants around your neighborhood. They usually, if it's an established colony, they can go about 7 feet deep. Still pretty impressive. That's way taller than I am. There was a nest in Japan that is now, we think it's pretty much obliterated now due to, human construction, but it had 45,000 nests And within those 45,000 nests, it was a super colony, and they had all these tunnels back and forth to each other. This thing covered 670 acres. That's insane. So up until the year 2000, that was the biggest ant colony in the world that we knew of. And then human construction, and we ruined their habitat, so it's not really there anymore. What's interesting about that one, when they study how long it takes for ants to build things and lifespan and generations and that sort of thing, they think that that one in Japan was there for 1,000 years. 1,000 years. Now, not long ago, this is what this picture of is right here, they found an abandoned leafcutter ant city in Brazil. Since there were no ants in it anymore, and they saw just like all these openings, just like all over the place. So they're like, I wonder what it looks like inside. So they excavated it. Oh. So right here, you kind of see a little bit. So they spent days and days and days. Yeah, it is like a historical landmark. You're totally right. They found all the tunnels. They found all the, you'll see these little sort of spherical looking things. So those are like your different chambers, your different rooms. So some of them are going to have the queen and the youngsters. Some of them are going to be like their trash heaps and their dead. They used 10 tons of concrete and they made a cast out of this thing. It went 26 feet below the surface. It took up about 500 square feet of space. So if you think about, I don't know, a sandcastle or a snowman or anything that you have built out of toothpicks or something, imagine making something this large. It's pretty incredible. Now to go on the smaller edge, again, here's another image, just for scale. It's amazing. That one just has a little bit of information for you. Okay, so this next example is amazing for a completely different reason. So we know ants can live in trees, and sometimes they will just form just kind of like a giant ball up in the tree, and you might mistake it for a termite mound or even a beehive, but sometimes they build their structures out of leaves. It's actually pretty cool. So again, we see all of these worker ant females that are pulling the leaves together, and they're using their mandibles, they're using their front legs, their back legs, all together. So there's a lot of collaboration, a lot of self-organization here. And then you can see here that this particular type of ant, this weaver ant, which is found in some regions of Africa, Tanzania to be particular, India and Australia are the main places where these weaver ants are found. And so they make silk the way that a spider does. And to get the right shape, they will use the silk, they can bend things together, they can attach various leaves until they make the structure that they want. But it gets weirder because it's nature, and it always does. Well, who makes the silk? It's the larva. So they take their babies, they squeeze them, the silk comes out of their butts, and that's what they use to glue their homes together. I love nature. That's so wild. So just like, again, like I love to imagine this stuff in terms of like humans. Can you imagine like squeezing a baby and being like, this is how I'm going to build my home? It's crazy. Yeah. Would not recommend. So this is in the end like what they would look like, which is almost a sort of stained glass looking thing. It's beautiful and a little disturbing. So sort of last general fact, for every one of them, with every one of us, there's 1.4 million of them. That's about 10 pounds of ants for every single one of us. So this right here is like a stack of 1,000,000 pennies. So there's 1.4 million ants for every one of us. And if we've got 7.8 billion people, they think before our population spiked to how insane it is now, that the biomass of ants was actually larger than the biomass of humans. So physically, if you took all of our bodies together and you weighed them, that the ants would weigh more than the humans. Yeah, Sophia, that's a good question. I'm not sure. All right, so here's the thing that makes my head explode. No, this ant does not have an exploding head. This is another sort of protector. Isn't that wild? So this is one in particular that if the giants that are out there sort of squeezing heads off and whatever and attacking something, these will plug up the doorways with their heads so none of the raiding columns of ants can come back in. So not an exploded head. It's just a badass. So how they do this makes my head explode, because they do all of these things without having anyone tell them what to do. There's no one in charge. Cooperate, self-organize, coordinate, manage the services, build all this stuff, find and distribute resources, all of this. No one tells them what to do. To me, that sounds kind of great. So to understand that, the easiest way to look at it is by comparing what humans do. So we know we've got this approach where we've got a boss. They own the information, they own the knowledge. That trickles down to the next people, the next people, the next people, the next people. And it's a little bit like playing that game of telephone, where as you pass that message down, sometimes things get lost in translation, you don't have buy-in. And then by the time it gets down to the bottom, it's taking forever to get that information down there. And then the peons at the bottom now have to put that information back up and down. And it's just really time consuming. It's not very efficient. And the power is really just, it's off. So we call that the centralized approach. Now I wrote on there that often, and this comes into play with the ants, often the people who are the bosses, whether that's one person or a small group, and the people at the bottom have massively different experiences. But the boss doesn't really care about the people down here. It's just end goal, profit, whatever the thing is. Answer what happened if we eat rich. So information goes top down. Oh, and also competition rules. We know this, like the movie like Wolf of Wall Street. We like to compare ourselves to predators. We like thinking of ourselves as being the top. And so because being cutthroat is incentivized, cooperation also generally isn't. So we wouldn't say that ants have culture. I'm not going to anthropomorphize them like that. But how they go about their societies is completely different. Now, ants have a completely decentralized approach. So, you guys are cracking me up. So who has the power? Who has the knowledge? Who gets to decide what to do? How is it passed down? Well, everybody. Everybody decides. And so really what happens is there's sort of two modes of communication. One, the ant, each individual ant is responding to stimuli in their environment, whether that's a predator, another ant is doing something, there's rain, whatever that is. So these operating conditions, these ants are constantly picking up on those signals, reacting, picking up, reacting, picking up, reacting by themselves. Now this information sometimes is also passed to ants next to them. So the ant can go, ah, yes, I agree with you. Let's all go this way. And so because they have just these tiny groups interacting, and these tiny groups interacting, but they're connected to these groups, and these tiny groups interacting with these tiny groups, then you have this massive, fast spread of information. So it's instantaneous. If there's a change in the environment, they all know right away, and they change their behavior immediately. There's no one telling them what to do. We call this property emergence, which just basically means that I have a ton of teeny little actions and little tiny simple rules, little interactions that together as they build form incredible complexity. So we see this also if you've seen anything about like swarm theory, where you've got like schooling fish, or a murmuration where you've got like the birds that are forming these beautiful patterns. It's just simple rules that they're following. But when there's so many of them, we have intricate designs. There is a way that humans do this, and the best analogy I could come up with is traffic. If you're driving in your car, you are reacting to things that you're experiencing in real time. You've got traffic lights, you've got an accident over here, this person's driving like a maniac. You're responding in the moment to the sensory information that you see. But we can also react to people who are really close to us and pick up information from them that's helpful for us. So if we hear someone honk their horn, we go, aha, okay, there's something happening over there. If we see like detour signs, if we see like the flashing lights on one of those street cleaners, there are also other things in our environment that's a little bit more like commensalism, where it's helping me, that other thing doesn't really know that it's helping me. So we do have a little bit of the self-organization in people, just not a ton. Okay. So how do they do this? Okay, they work together. They've got different classes. As they age, they can take on different jobs. They operate on tiny little feedback loops, concentrating on what they're experiencing in the moment, reacting to that, and reacting to each other. Well, they use pheromone tags for a lot of this stuff. And I'm sure you guys have all heard of the word pheromones before. Pheromones are basically just hormones that are external. So we have chemical communication here. Now, have you guys heard of the t-shirt study with like sweat? Have you heard of this? I see a couple of you nodding. So there's like, we also, moths, there's a lot of animals that react to scent. We also do, we just don't know it. So a while ago, researchers did this thing where they had people like wear the same shirt for a bunch of days in a row, so they would sweat in it and get it all stinky. And then they had people of the opposite sex in this case that were like, there's, you know, sort of traditional cis hetero things going on there. And they had like the females and the males sniff each other's shirts and rank them to like the most acceptable to the most disgusting. And they found that depending on like your DNA kind of made you think that. So you were going to be more attracted to the person who had more of a different scent than you did. That's also why we have armpit hair. It's a dispersal mechanism for scent. We just, you know, we don't think about that because it's a little gross. So the ants do the same thing. We do the same thing. We just don't know it. So I gave you a little bit of my notes right here. So if this little green guy is the nest, just like finding a new home in the case of the bivouac where they're roving. So again, I'm going to look at nests that are stationary right now. So they're going to send out these scouts. These scouts don't know how far away something is. So they will, you'll see on the way that I drew that, they're not going in a straight line. They tend as scouts to kind of do this. Why do you think they do that? Why would they do this instead of going droop? Any guesses?
Can cover more ground potentially?
Yeah, exactly. They're going to cover more area by doing that. And like, they're tiny. A food resource for them might be just a really small thing. So they're covering. As they do, and I put this in like the lighter blue, they walk a little, they leave a pheromone tag. They mark a little bit, chemical scent. Kind of think about this as like, you know, the dogs and other animals we know, they're like marking their territory. Only instead of being like, this is mine, stay away, they're like, ooh, come here. They walk until they've just gone so far that they're like, there's nothing here. Or until they find something. Well, if you look at C versus A, who's going to get back to the colony first? It's pretty obvious, C. But there's something different that happens here that's maybe a little bit less obvious. Not only do they leave the pheromone tags on the way out, they also leave them again on the way back. So there's something about the concentration of those pheromones that tells them, ooh, this is a really good path. So if I look at A, think of this as like when you go in a department store, like some obnoxious person tries to like spray you with perfume as you're walking in. At the beginning, I've got these strong, like little perfume spritzes. By that time, that ant gets way over here. These pheromone tags have already kind of disintegrated into the environment. And so then by the time this ant comes meandering back, that might be the only one pheromone tag that's still there. Versus C, that one goes out, she comes back, much stronger concentration. So any other ant that's there, she doesn't have to round them all up and go, take this path. They can tell there's more of a concentration there, so they go. So another human analogy for this, if you've ever gone skiing or you've gone on some like backcountry hikes where they'll put a tag up on a tree, but they just do it just far enough away so that you can see it and go, all right, I'm on the right path. They don't do it every like 3 feet if they were humans, because they don't want to waste resources. So think of it as like the breadcrumbs, Hansel and Gretel, whatever. So concentration is the main thing here. But there's a life principle getting in here. Oh, in just a second. Okay, what if they want the opposite? We're getting ahead a little bit. What if there's a predator? What if there's just nothing going on up there? So we have this concentration thing, but the pharaoh ant, which I always spell that word wrong, the A and the O should be switched. The pharaoh ant also will put a completely different pheromonal tag up there to say, don't waste your time here. You can just ignore that. So we've got concentration and we've got others going, don't bother. So you maybe have like less scouts in this case. So those are ones that are more situated in a colony. What if you're looking for resources and you've got that bivouac and you're a marauder ant or an army ant, and you got to move your entire home base of hundreds of thousands or millions of ants? Well, you can't do quite the same things. So this is an example of what the army ants in Panama do. They have a highway system. So they've got this giant bivouac where the queen is like nestled inside. And when they found like a good place for her in a log or whatever, again, they sort of fan out and they try to find resources. Now, because they're trying to, as Sophia put it, they're trying to cover more ground. So they're going to spread out a little bit more to do that. They're looking for stuff. They're looking for stuff. Now, when they find something, they grab it, hold on to it. Usually they'll put it on their backs, or if it's little, they'll put it in their little mandibles, and they go marching back. They're marching now in sort of a straight line because once again, they can sense those pheromone tags. And since I have a huge amount of ants, they know exactly where they're going, which is even more incredible because they're blind. Can't see a thing. Some ants can, they can't see a thing. So we've got them spreading out. They can move pretty quickly because they're not carrying anything. They find something and they come back. Now, engineers have modeled this to, again, look for human emulation. And they said they are really close to the maximum potential when it comes to like how fast you can move. This is the strategy. This is not something that we generally see. Our roads or our paths tend to be, you know, a standard that's the same for everybody, unless we see this a little bit in humans. If you've ever been on a trail where maybe it got like wet and muddy in the middle, and then you can see where other pathways kind of formed around it, that's called braiding the trail. You kind of move out of the way. You do this a little bit, but generally, no, we don't have flexible roads. Okay. So this is where I was getting at before. We know from our life's principles here, so this should be a light bulb going off in your head, that we always have to have a backup system. We don't want to just rely on one thing, because if something goes haywire, then you're screwed. So we see that we have got multiple backup systems here. Well, one of the experiments that scientists did was they took a mirror, they bounced the sunlight in, and they looked to see what ants would do. And generally, we found out that they can use the angle to determine where they are. So on a large scale, they can find their way back. Now, obviously, this isn't the last example because they were blind. But in this example, they go, right, sun's there, home's that way. So they can use the sun to navigate. I can't really do that. Bees also do this, which makes sense. So when they go off and they find a food source, they will come back. They do this sort of like figure 8 sort of dance. The length of the dance tells them how far away the food is, and the direction they're pointing is the direction that they go in. So not only do we see in bees this, okay, I'm looking here, this is the sun, so this is the direction, here's where I'm gonna go, but they also have the communication and change in behavior. Well, what if the sun is unavailable? If the sun is unavailable, there's a different kind of desert ant. Most of these are desert ants. They spend the first couple weeks of their lives underground in the colony. And when they come back up, I've got this kind of goofy picture here. So that center circle is the nest opening. They will go around, make a loop, and then look back at the nest. Go around, loop, go around, loop, go around, loop. They can't see the nest opening though. They're far enough away that they can't see their home. And each time that they loop and they stop, every time they're pointing at the nest. What are they doing? Well, after they've done that, and they're looking now for resources, they do the same sort of curvy path, but now they have loops in it. They go a little bit, they loop. They go a little bit, they loop. They go a little bit, they find their resource. And then instead of taking that really inefficient way back, they turn around, they go straight back to their houses. Well, what are they doing? Well, some scientists, to test this, they went to Greece. They put up some of these Helmholtz coils. They created a magnetic field. They manipulated that magnetic field, and that's what the ants were using. So if it was here, and they knew their home was there, they went, all right, it's that way. And if they moved the magnetic field, they used that same distance, but now they're going to a fictitious nest because it moved. Because generally, does our magnetic, you know, like our electromagnetic powers of our Earth, that's not shifting, usually. I mean, our poles do flip, but so they also use magnetism, which is wild. We know some birds do that. Some birds have like little bits of metal, basically. I'm not sure if it's, I think it's concentrated in their head somewhere, I don't remember. We don't really know how ants do that.
Professor,
Yeah.
on the 2 slides before this one, the loops, what do the loops do again? Why do they form?
Oh, so what they're doing, they're orienting themselves. Thank you for that. So as they're going, they spin, they go, they spin, they go, they spin. They are keeping track of where the electromagnetic field is. And so that's those 2 days that they're going around. They're orienting themselves directly to the nest. So now any direction that they go, boom, they can go right back because they know where their nest is. Now we found they also use different strategies. Again, there's a life's principle in there. So they use the main strategy to orient and then to go, okay, straight back. But as they get closer, then they use a different strategy. So we call those allocentric because they're using external clues in their environment to find their way back home. So then scientists went, well, there's this other kind of ant that carries a smaller ant that's usually an ant that stays inside the colony. And they bring that other ant out into the world. What if the ants aren't walking? Can they still figure out kind of how to get back to their home? Yes, they can. And so we found that not only are they using the angle of the sun, and not only are they using the magnetic field, but they also have like odometers in their brains. They know how many steps they've taken. And because these particular ants have visual acuity, they've memorized the landmarks. So as they're going, oh, there's a pebble, there's a leaf, there's a twig. They know to find their ways back home because they can tell, oh, there's a little pheromone. Okay, I feel that another pheromone over here. Okay, I remember that leaf. All right, I've taken about this number of steps. So they are processing multiple different types of information all at once. So it's not something that we thought ants could do. And so we found that the little tiny ants that were riding on piggyback, they could get back as well, even though they weren't the ones taking the steps. They still had some sort of internal odometer that was telling them how far away they were. And we also learned that ants can do this backwards. Again, this gets into, again, that visual memory component. So the scientists made a maze, and they made sure they had at least one 90-degree turn in there, and they put a little crumb at the end. And so first they had the ants sort of navigate through this thing, get familiar with it. They pick up the crumb, they turn around, they go back. Well, then they did the same thing, but they put a much larger crumb in there so that when the ants picked it up, they couldn't turn around. So they grabbed it, they tried, no, they can't. So they were able to walk backwards and know, again, exactly where the nest was, using those landmarks, mostly of that, you know, the angles, and then to make sure, so think about like if you've ever helped someone carry in a big piece of furniture or a moving box or something, there's always one person walking forward and one person walking backwards. Well, every once in a while, you gotta look behind you. Well, that's what the ants do too, because they wanna find, where's the right place? Am I gonna run into something? Where exactly am I gonna put it? So it's preventing from danger. We've got some precision here. So the ants will put down the crumb. They remember where the nest is so they can look back. They check out the surroundings, so we've got the visual acuity there. They turn back, they remember they have to pick up the crumb, they pick up the crumb, and now they go backwards again. And they found that they can do this walking sideways, walking backwards, it doesn't matter. Since they're so good at orienting themselves to where the nest is, they can go in any direction because they're using multiple strategies. So if you have an ant that has damaged antenna or wherever those chemical receptors are that are feeling for the pheromones, well, I've still got like 6 other strategies that I can use. All right, oh, finished right on time. I was worried. So I just packed in there a ton of this stuff and a ton of this stuff. I'm going to throw you guys into groups for 15 minutes so that you, let's stop this for just a second, okay? So that you can talk to each other, go through some of these strategies, mark things that maybe the other people didn't have as examples, and even more importantly, because we've gotten a little less experience with this, some of you have taken the other class before, some of you haven't. What are the main ones that we saw? And if you have the other side of this side is actually a lot more helpful because it breaks down exactly what these things are. So groups, repeat some of this stuff because it's good for your brain. What are the strategies? Again, think of scale. Whole colony, individual. If we've got some pheromone action in there, that's going to get into more of the molecular. That's what we're looking at. Okay, so I'm going to throw you in rooms for just